He built an empire where no one dared look him in the eye, but the only person who could save his son was the one he had never truly seen. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe dignity still matters, stay with this story. Now, back to Dominic Castellano. The night the storm rolled over the estate, the sky above Westchester County turned a deep shade of iron grey, the kind that swallowed sound and pressed silence into every corner of the world. Inside the mansion, polished marble floors reflected dim emergency lights as the power flickered and died, leaving only shadows stretching along the walls like something alive. Dominic Castellano stood in the center of his private study, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, a man who had negotiated million-dollar deals without blinking, now frozen by something far more terrifying than any rival. From the second floor, the sound came again, a child crying, not loud, not wild, but strained, uneven, like someone trying to hold back a storm inside their chest. His son. Matteo had been like this for hours. Doctors had come and gone, their polished shoes echoing through the halls, their reassurances empty, their prescriptions useless. Dominic had paid more for their time than most people made in a year, but none of it mattered now. Money had no voice in a child's fear. He just needs rest, one of them had said earlier. But Dominic knew better. He knew that kind of silence. It was the kind that came before something broke. Upstairs. The cries softened for a moment, then returned. Sharper this time, cutting through the house like glass. Dominic exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against the edge of his desk, grounding himself in the weight of the wood, the texture of control he was used to. He didn't lose control. Not in business, not in life. But this was different, because this was the one thing he couldn't command. Somewhere else in the mansion. Far from the polished offices and guarded hallways, Naomi Carter stood in the dim glow of a flickering service corridor light. Her hands were still damp from dishwater, her uniform slightly wrinkled from a long shift that had started before sunrise. 5 years in this house, and she had learned exactly how to exist without being seen. Move quietly, speak only when spoken to, never interrupt, never ask questions, never draw attention. She had become part of the background, like the furniture or the walls themselves, the kind of presence people only noticed when something was out of place. But tonight, something was out of place. The crying. It had started hours ago, faint at first, barely noticeable over the hum of the estate, but now it was impossible to ignore. Naomi paused, her breath catching just slightly as the sound reached her again. It wasn't just noise. It was pain. The kind that didn't come from a scraped knee or a bad dream. The kind that came from being overwhelmed. Trapped inside something too big to understand. She had heard it before, years ago, in a different life. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the cleaning cart, knuckles whitening as memory brushed against her like a cold wind. She should stay where she was. That was the rule. That was always the rule. The second floor was restricted. Especially his son's room, especially tonight. She knew what happened to people who broke rules in this house. They didn't get second chances. They simply disappeared from the schedule, replaced by someone new before the next morning. And yet, the crying didn't stop. It echoed down the corridor, threading its way through the silence, settling somewhere deep in her chest where logic couldn't reach. Naomi closed her eyes for a second. Just one. As if that might quiet the sound. It didn't. When she opened them again, something had already shifted. Upstairs. Dominic moved toward the staircase. Each step measured, controlled, but heavier than usual. He had ordered everyone to stay away. Staff, security, even the head housekeeper had been dismissed, No one touched his son without his permission. No one crossed that line. But as he reached the base of the stairs, something else caught his attention. The crying had changed. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't the same. It had softened, not completely, not enough to call it calm, but enough to make him stop mid-step. The house held its breath. Somewhere above him, in a room no one was supposed to enter, the impossible was beginning to unfold, and neither of them knew that by the time the night ended, everything they thought they understood about power, about silence, about being seen, would be rewritten. Naomi moved before she could think, her steps quiet against the service hallway floor, as if the house itself was trying to keep her hidden. But the sound of Matteo's crying pulled her forward with a force stronger than fear, stronger than the rules she had followed for 5 long years. And with each step up the narrow back staircase, memories pressed closer, the echo of another small voice from another time, another room, a life she had buried beneath silence and routine. The second floor felt different tonight, darker, heavier. The emergency lights casting long shadows that made every door seem closed not just by wood, but by unspoken boundaries. And at the end of the hall stood the one door she had never crossed, the one every employee knew without being told to avoid, the one that belonged to Dominic Castellano's son. She stopped just short of it, her hand hovering inches from the handle, as Matteo's cries rose again, sharper now, uneven, like breaths caught in panic. And for a moment the rules returned, loud and clear in her mind. Do not enter, do not interfere, do not be seen. But then the crying shifted again, not louder, but more fragile, and something inside her broke through the years of obedience. She turned the handle. The room was dim, curtains drawn tight against the storm outside. The only light coming from a small lamp in the corner that flickered with the unstable power. And in the center of the room, surrounded by expensive furniture that meant nothing in this moment, Matteo sat curled into himself on the floor beside the bed, his small hands pressed tightly over his ears, his breathing uneven, his whole body rigid with something far deeper than fear. Naomi did not rush forward. She did not speak right away. She simply closed the door behind her with a soft click and lowered herself slowly to the floor several feet away from him, careful not to invade the space he was trying so desperately to protect. She had seen this before. Not in a mansion, not surrounded by wealth, but in a small apartment where noise came from thin walls and life never slowed down. She remembered how overwhelming the world could feel when it refused to quiet itself, how every sound became too sharp, too loud, too much. She placed her hands gently on her knees and began to hum, softly at first, a low, steady sound, not a song meant to be heard, but a rhythm meant to be felt, something consistent, something safe. Matteo did not react immediately, his breathing still uneven, his shoulders tight. But the sound did not stop. It did not demand anything from him. It simply existed in the space with him, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, his hands loosened against his ears. Naomi kept her voice low, steady, her eyes never forcing contact, giving him the choice to look or not. "It is okay," she whispered, her tone calm, grounded, as if the storm outside did not exist, as if the world could shrink down to just this moment, just this room. Matteo's breathing shifted, still fast but no longer breaking, his fingers curling instead of pressing, and after what felt like minutes, stretched into something longer. He lowered one hand just enough to peek through, his eyes wide, uncertain, but searching. Naomi did not move closer. She only softened her voice, letting the hum return between her words. "You are safe," she said, not as a promise she could guarantee, but as a feeling she was trying to give him. downstairs. Dominic reached the midpoint of the staircase, his steps slowing as he listened. The change in the sound upstairs unmistakable now. It was still his son, still distressed, but something had shifted. Something had entered the space that he did not understand, and that unfamiliarity tightened his chest more than the crying ever had. He took the rest of the stairs quickly now, not rushing, never rushing, but with a controlled urgency that carried him down the hall, past the closed doors, toward the one place he had ordered no one to enter. When he reached it, he did not open it immediately, his hand resting on the handle as he listened. And what he heard on the other side made him pause. Not silence, not complete calm, but something else. A soft voice, low, steady, unfamiliar. Dominic's jaw tightened, his mind moving through possibilities, none of them acceptable. No one was supposed to be in that room. No one had permission. And yet the sound of his son was no longer breaking. It was changing, settling into something he had not heard in hours. He opened the door. The scene before him stopped him mid-step. Naomi on the floor, her posture calm, her voice barely above a whisper. Matteo no longer curled as tightly, his breathing uneven but no longer spiraling, his gaze fixed not on the walls or the floor but on her. For a moment, no one spoke, the air in the room holding still as Dominic stood there, his presence filling the space in a way it always did. But something about this moment refused to bend to it, refused to react the way the world usually did when he entered. Naomi felt him before she saw him, the shift in the room unmistakable. But she did not turn immediately. She did not stand. She did not break the rhythm she had created, because the child in front of her still needed it more than she needed to respond to the man behind her. Matteo's fingers reached out slightly, not toward Dominic, but toward the steady presence in front of him, and Naomi, with careful intention, extended her hand just enough for him to choose, not to take, not to force, just to offer. And in that quiet, fragile space, something happened that Dominic Castellano had not been able to command, not with power, not with money, not with control. His son reached forward and took her hand. Dominic did not move, not at first, because what he was seeing did not align with anything he understood about control or authority. It did not respond to presence or command. It simply unfolded in front of him as if he were no longer the center of the room. And for a man who had spent his entire life shaping outcomes with a glance or a word, that realization settled into his chest with unfamiliar weight. Matteo's small hand rested in Naomi's, his fingers no longer rigid but curled, tentative, as if testing something fragile yet real. And Naomi did not tighten her grip, did not claim the moment. She simply allowed it, her voice still low, steady, continuing that quiet rhythm that had begun to anchor the child's breathing. Dominic's eyes shifted from his son to the woman on the floor, truly looking at her for the first time, not as part of the staff, not as a function within his house, but as a presence in the room that had altered something he could not fix. Naomi felt the weight of his gaze now, heavy and direct, and slowly, carefully, she lifted her eyes to meet his, not in defiance, not in challenge, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if she understood the line she had crossed and chose to stand on it anyway. For a brief moment, the storm outside pressed harder against the windows, thunder rolling in the distance, and the light flickered again, casting shifting shadows across Dominic's face. But he did not speak, because the words that would normally come, the commands, the questions, the consequences, none of them seemed to fit the scene before him. Instead, he stepped into the room. The sound of his shoes soft against the carpet, controlled, measured, yet lacking the sharp finality that usually followed his movement, and Matteo's eyes flickered toward him, not with panic, not with the usual tension Dominic had come to expect, but with a kind of quiet awareness. As if the fear that had filled the space hours earlier had begun to loosen its grip. Naomi adjusted her posture slightly, still seated on the floor, still maintaining the distance that allowed Matteo to feel safe. And she spoke again, her voice calm, directed toward the child, but audible enough for Dominic to hear. "You are doing good. Just breathe with me." And she demonstrated it, slow, steady, her own breathing visible in the rise and fall of her shoulders, giving the boy something to mirror rather than something to obey. Dominic watched as Matteo's chest followed that rhythm, uneven at first, then gradually more controlled, and something inside him tightened, not with fear this time, but with something deeper, something closer to recognition. He had spent hours trying to fix this, to solve it, to apply every resource at his disposal. And yet it was this quiet presence, this simple, deliberate patience, that had reached his son in a way he could not. His voice, when it finally came, was lower than usual, not sharp, not commanding, but restrained. "Who are you?" he asked. Not because he did not know her name on paper, but because the woman in front of him did not match the invisible figure he had passed in hallways for years. Naomi did not look away, but she did not rise either. She kept her attention split, one part on the man whose house she had entered without permission, the other on the child who still held her hand, and she answered simply, "Naomi Carter." "Sir." Her tone steady, respectful, but without the usual fear that colored every interaction between staff and employer in this house. Dominic's gaze lingered, searching, as if trying to place her within the rigid structure of his world, but finding no immediate answer, and before he could continue. Matteo shifted closer to Naomi, his grip tightening just slightly, a silent request that she remain exactly where she was. Naomi responded by softening her voice again, lowering the hum, guiding his focus back to the rhythm they had created. And Dominic felt something shift inside him at that small, instinctive exchange, something that did not belong to power or control, something that existed entirely outside of it. He moved closer now, stopping a few feet away, close enough to see the details he had never noticed before, the steadiness in Naomi's posture, the calm in her expression, the absence of panic in a situation where most would have been overwhelmed by his presence alone, and it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately define. "You should not be in here," he said finally, the words carrying the structure of a rule, but lacking the force that usually made them absolute. And Naomi nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth of it without retreating. "I know," she said, her voice still quiet, still grounded, but he needed someone to help him slow down. And she glanced briefly at Matteo before returning her gaze to Dominic, not asking permission, not apologizing in the way he expected, but stating a reality that had already taken place. The room fell into a brief, heavy silence, the kind that held more meaning than words. And Dominic realized, with a clarity that surprised him, that the outcome had already shifted. The rule had been broken, the line had been crossed, and yet the result in front of him was not chaos, not disorder, but something closer to calm. Matteo's breathing steadied further, his shoulders relaxing, his hand still wrapped around Naomi's, as if letting go would undo whatever had been rebuilt in the past few minutes. And Dominic stood there, a man who had always defined the boundaries of every room he entered, now watching as those boundaries quietly reshaped themselves without his command. The silence stretched just long enough to feel fragile, like something that could break if anyone moved too quickly. And Dominic understood that instinctively, even if he could not explain why. So he remained where he was, his presence no longer pushing into the room but settling into it, observing instead of controlling, something he had not done in years. Matteo's grip on Naomi's hand loosened slightly, not because he was pulling away, but because the tension that had held his small body rigid was finally beginning to release. And Naomi adjusted her breathing again, slower now, softer, guiding him without words into a steadier rhythm, her voice returning in quiet intervals, each word placed carefully. "That is it. You are doing better." And the boy responded not with speech but with the gradual relaxation of his shoulders, the unclenching of his fingers, the subtle shift from panic to something closer to calm. Dominic took another step forward, his movements deliberate. And for the first time that night, he lowered himself, not into a chair, not behind a desk, but onto one knee, bringing himself closer to Matteo's level. An action so unfamiliar that even he seemed aware of its weight, and Matteo's eyes flickered toward him again, this time without the immediate recoil that had defined their interactions earlier, and Dominic felt something tighten in his chest, something he did not have a name for. Naomi noticed the shift, the way Dominic had changed his posture, the way his voice had softened, and she understood without needing to be told that this moment was no longer just about calming a child, it was about something larger, something neither of them had planned. And she spoke again, gently, "You can stay here with him." Her words directed toward Dominic now, not as an instruction, but as an invitation, one that did not challenge his authority, but quietly redirected it. Dominic hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because he doubted her, but because he was not used to being guided, especially not by someone who had been invisible to him for so long. And yet, something in her tone, in the steadiness of it, made him listen, and slowly. He shifted closer, careful not to disrupt the fragile balance that had been created in the room. Matteo's hand remained in Naomi's, but his gaze moved between them now, as if acknowledging both presences. And Naomi adjusted her position slightly, creating space without breaking contact, allowing Dominic to enter the moment without forcing it. And in that quiet coordination, something unspoken passed between them, a mutual understanding built not on hierarchy, but on the shared goal of helping the child in front of them. "Matteo," Dominic said, his voice lower than it had been earlier, less commanding, more measured. And the boy's eyes met his, not fully, not with complete ease, but enough to hold the connection for a second longer than before, and Dominic exhaled slowly, matching the rhythm Naomi had set, his movements less rigid, less controlled, as if he were learning something he had never been taught. The storm outside continued to press against the windows, rain tapping steadily against the glass. But inside the room, the tension had shifted, no longer sharp and overwhelming, but softening, settling into something quieter, something manageable. Naomi watched as Matteo's breathing evened out further, the rise and fall of his chest becoming more consistent, and she knew this moment, this fragile calm, was not permanent, but it was enough to give him rest, enough to bring him back from the edge he had been standing on for hours. Dominic's gaze returned to Naomi, more focused now, more intentional, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not just curiosity, but recognition, the beginning of it, as if he were seeing pieces of her that had always been there, but had never been allowed to exist in his awareness. "How did you know what to do?" he asked quietly, the question not carrying suspicion, but something closer to genuine need. And Naomi paused for a moment, her eyes dropping briefly to Matteo before returning to Dominic, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that did not come from the present moment alone. "Because I have seen this before," she said. Simple, direct, without elaboration, but the way she said it, the way her voice held steady despite the memory behind it, told Dominic that there was more beneath the surface than she was choosing to reveal. He studied her for a moment longer, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable, but filled with something unspoken. And then he nodded once, a small, controlled gesture, but one that carried more meaning than any command he could have given. Matteo shifted again, this time leaning slightly toward Dominic. Not fully, not completely, but enough to signal a change, and Dominic responded instinctively. His hand moving forward slowly, stopping just short of contact, giving the boy the same choice Naomi had given him earlier. And after a brief pause, Matteo's free hand reached out, resting lightly against his father's fingers. The room held that moment, quiet, steady, as two worlds that had been separated by distance and misunderstanding began to close the gap, not through force, not through instruction, but through something far simpler, something Dominic had never considered as power. And as he looked from his son to Naomi, he understood, for the first time, that what had changed this night was not just Matteo's fear, but the way he himself saw the person who had been standing in his home all along, unseen, unheard, until now. The moment lingered longer than any of them expected, quiet and fragile, as if the room itself understood that something rare had taken place and refused to disturb it. And Dominic remained exactly where he was, his hand still beneath Matteo's smaller one, not gripping, not guiding, simply present, something he had not allowed himself to be in years. Naomi slowly eased her voice into silence, letting the rhythm fade naturally rather than cutting it off, because she knew that calm, once forced, could break just as easily as it formed. And Matteo's breathing, now steady and soft, followed that absence of sound without resistance, his body leaning slightly against the edge of the bed as exhaustion finally began to replace the tension that had held him for hours. Dominic watched this shift carefully, his eyes tracing every detail as if committing it to memory. The way Naomi had not rushed, the way she had not demanded anything from the child, the way she had created space instead of filling it, and the realization settled deeper with each passing second that none of this had been accidental, none of it had been luck. "He is going to sleep soon," Naomi said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might undo the calm they had built. And Dominic nodded almost instinctively, though his gaze remained fixed on Matteo, as if he were afraid that looking away would cause the moment to disappear. Slowly, Naomi shifted her hand, not pulling away abruptly, but easing the contact so that Matteo could adjust. And for a brief second, his fingers tightened again, a silent request for reassurance, and she responded with a gentle, steady touch before letting her hand rest lightly on the floor beside her, giving him the sense that she was still there without holding him in place. Dominic noticed that too, the subtlety of it, the balance between presence and freedom. And something about it unsettled him in a way that was not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar, because it was not control. It was trust. "Stay," Matteo murmured softly. The word barely formed, but clear enough to be understood, and Naomi's eyes softened at the sound, a flicker of emotion passing through her expression before she steadied it again. And Dominic felt that same tightening in his chest, sharper this time, because it was not just the word itself, but who it was directed to. Naomi glanced at Dominic then, not asking permission, not challenging him, but acknowledging the unspoken reality of the room. And Dominic held her gaze for a moment before giving a slight nod, a decision made without words. And Naomi returned her attention to Matteo, her voice gentle once more. "I am right here," she said, and this time the words carried not just reassurance, but continuity, something that extended beyond the moment. The minutes that followed passed quietly. The storm outside beginning to soften, the rain no longer striking the windows with the same intensity. And inside the room, Matteo's breathing deepened into sleep, his body finally releasing the last traces of tension, his hand resting loosely against his father's, no longer gripping, but not pulling away either. Dominic remained still, watching, listening, as if confirming that this calm was real, that it was not another temporary shift that would disappear the moment he tried to understand it. And when he was certain, when the steady rhythm of Matteo's breathing filled the room without interruption, he slowly withdrew his hand, careful not to disturb the child, his movements deliberate, controlled, but softer than they had ever been. Naomi began to rise then, slowly, her movements quiet, practiced, as if she were returning to the role she had always occupied, the invisible presence that entered and exited without leaving a trace. But before she could fully stand, Dominic spoke again, his voice low, measured, but carrying something new beneath it. Wait. And the word stopped her just long enough for the moment to shift once more. She turned back toward him, her posture still composed, her expression neutral, but her eyes attentive. And Dominic stood as well, closing the distance between them by a few steps, not enough to impose, but enough to acknowledge that the conversation between them was no longer defined by distance alone. "You said you have seen this before," he continued, his gaze steady, searching, and Naomi hesitated for the briefest moment, not because she was unsure of the answer, but because she was choosing how much of it to give. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, but carried a quiet weight. "I used to work in pediatric care," she said, each word measured, "before I came here." And Dominic absorbed that, the information settling into place alongside everything else he had just witnessed, and for the first time. The question was not why she had acted, but why he had never known. 5 years, he said slowly, more to himself than to her. "You have been here for 5 years," and Naomi nodded once, a simple confirmation, and the silence that followed was different now, not empty, but filled with the realization of time, of presence overlooked, of something that had always been within reach but never acknowledged. Dominic looked at her again, truly looked, and in that moment, the structure of his world shifted in a way he could not ignore, because the person standing in front of him was no longer invisible, and the night had made that impossible to undo. Dominic did not respond immediately, because the weight of what she had said settled into the room with more force than any command he could have given. Pediatric care. The words echoed quietly in his mind as he looked at her, not as an employee, not as a background presence, but as someone who had carried knowledge, experience, and something deeper into his house without ever being asked to share it. The storm outside had softened into a steady drizzle, the kind that no longer demanded attention. And inside the room, the silence around Matteo felt stable now, no longer fragile, but anchored, his small body resting against the bed, his breathing even, his face relaxed in a way Dominic had not seen in weeks. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, standing now with a quiet composure that suggested she was ready to leave, to return to the role she had always held, the one that required her to disappear as soon as she was no longer needed. And for a moment, Dominic realized that if he said nothing, if he allowed the pattern to continue, she would walk out of this room and the house would return to its old rhythm, unchanged on the surface, as if nothing significant had happened at all. "Why did you leave?" he asked suddenly, the question coming before he could measure it. And Naomi paused, her hand resting lightly against the back of a chair, her posture still, her expression unreadable for a brief second as she considered the weight of the question. She could have answered simply, could have given him something vague, something that maintained distance, but instead, she chose honesty, not all of it, but enough to carry truth. Because sometimes knowing how to help is not enough, she said quietly, her voice steady. Sometimes you still lose them. And the words settled between them, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy with meaning that did not need explanation. Dominic felt that again, that unfamiliar tightening in his chest. Stronger now, sharper, because this was not about his world, not about power or control. This was about something he could not negotiate with, something he could not fix after the fact. And he looked at her differently because of it, not just with recognition, but with something closer to understanding. "You stayed here," he said after a moment, his voice lower now, more thoughtful. 5 years, and Naomi nodded once, her gaze steady, and Dominic exhaled slowly, as if the realization required space to settle. Because 5 years was not a short time. It was not temporary. It was not insignificant. It was presence, consistent and unacknowledged. And no one asked you to do more than clean, he continued, the words not accusatory but reflective. And Naomi's lips pressed together slightly before she answered. That was the job, she said, simple, factual. But the quiet tone carried something more. Not resentment, not bitterness, just acceptance of what had been. Dominic looked around the room then, at the carefully arranged furniture, the expensive objects that filled the space, the systems he had built to maintain order, and for the first time, he saw the absence within it, not of things, but of awareness, of attention, of the people who moved through it without ever being seen. Matteo shifted slightly in his sleep, a small movement that drew both of their attention back to him. And Dominic stepped closer to the bed, adjusting the blanket gently, his movements slower than usual, more deliberate. And when he looked back at Naomi, there was something in his expression that had shifted. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough to be noticed. "You will not go back to cleaning tomorrow," he said. The statement quiet but firm, not delivered as a command in the way he usually spoke, but as a decision that had already taken shape. And Naomi's eyes flickered with something brief, surprise, uncertainty, something she did not immediately voice. Because in this house, changes like that did not come without consequence. "I did not ask for anything," she replied carefully, her voice still composed, still respectful, but carrying a quiet boundary. And Dominic nodded once, acknowledging that. "I know," he said. And there was something in the way he said it that made it clear this was not about repayment, not about obligation, but about something else, something he was still trying to define. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence did not feel heavy. It felt intentional, as if both of them understood that the moment had shifted into something new, something that extended beyond the night itself. Dominic glanced once more at Matteo, confirming the steady rhythm of his breathing, and then back at Naomi, holding her gaze with a level of focus that had not been present before, and for a brief second, there was no distance between them defined by roles or expectations. Only the shared understanding of what had happened in that room. "Tomorrow," he said finally, his voice steady. "We will talk." And it was not a dismissal, not a command to leave, but a continuation, an acknowledgement that this was not the end of the moment, but the beginning of something that would require more than a single night to understand. Naomi inclined her head slightly, accepting that without question, and then, with the same quiet composure she had always carried, she turned toward the door, her steps soft, controlled, as if she were slipping back into the rhythm she had known for years. But as she reached the threshold, she paused for just a second, her gaze flickering once more toward Matteo, then toward Dominic. And in that brief exchange, something unspoken settled into place, something that could not be undone, because the man who stood in that room was no longer the same one who had walked past her without seeing her, and the night had made sure of that. The door closed behind Naomi with a softness that matched the night, and for a moment Dominic remained exactly where he was, standing beside his son's bed, listening to the steady rhythm of Matteo's breathing as if it was something new, something fragile that required his full attention. And perhaps it did, because for the first time in a long while, the silence in the room did not feel like absence. It felt like presence, something earned rather than enforced. He reached out again, adjusting the blanket just slightly where it had shifted, his movements careful, almost unfamiliar in their restraint, and as he straightened, his gaze drifted toward the door Naomi had just passed through, the space she had occupied still holding something of her, not physically, but in the way the room itself seemed altered by her presence. 5 years. The number returned to him again, not as information, but as a weight, a measure of time that now felt longer than it should have. Longer because of what it contained, or rather, what it had not contained. Acknowledgement, attention, recognition, downstairs. The house had begun to settle back into its usual order, the emergency lights stabilizing, the faint hum of power returning to the walls. But Dominic did not move to follow that rhythm, not yet, because something inside him had shifted, and he was not ready to let it go unnoticed the way he had allowed so many other things to pass. When he finally stepped out into the hallway, the air felt different, not because the house had changed, but because his awareness had. And as he moved down the corridor, his pace slower than usual, his mind did not turn to business, to schedules, to the countless details that normally filled his thoughts. Instead, it remained fixed on a single, unexpected question. How had he missed her? The staff quarters were quiet at this hour, the kind of quiet that came from long routines and unspoken boundaries. And Naomi moved through them with the same quiet efficiency she had always carried, her steps measured, her posture composed, but something beneath that composure had shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but internally, in the space where she had learned to remain small, to remain unseen, because tonight she had not been invisible, not entirely, and that recognition, brief as it had been, lingered in a way she could not ignore. She paused just inside her room, a small space compared to the rest of the house. Simple, functional. And for a moment, she allowed herself to exhale fully, the tension she had held throughout the night finally releasing. Not because she feared consequences, though she knew they could come, but because she had crossed a line she had respected for years, and there was no returning to the exact place she had stood before. Back in his study. Dominic did not sit. He did not reach for the papers that had been left waiting. Instead, he stood by the window, looking out at the rain as it slowed to a soft, steady pattern, and he found himself replaying the night in fragments. The sound of Matteo's crying, the stillness of the room, Naomi's voice, calm and steady, the way she had not reacted to his presence with fear or urgency, but with focus, with purpose, as if what mattered most in that moment had nothing to do with him. It was that detail that returned to him again and again, not what she had done, but how she had done it, without hesitation, without seeking approval, without waiting to be told. And for a man who had built his world on being the center of every decision, every action, that realization settled deeply, reshaping something he had never questioned before. The next morning arrived with a quiet clarity, the kind that followed a storm, the air crisp, the light filtering through the windows in a way that made everything appear sharper, more defined, and as the house began to wake, staff moving through their routines, the familiar rhythm returned, but Dominic did not follow it blindly as he always had. Instead, he observed, not from a distance of authority, but with a focus that had not been there before, noticing the details he had overlooked, the quiet movements, the presence of people who kept the house functioning without ever drawing attention to themselves. When Naomi entered the main hallway later that morning, dressed as she always was, her expression calm, her posture composed, she moved with the same quiet efficiency, but the space around her felt different, not because of her, but because of the way Dominic saw it. And as their paths crossed, something that had never happened before took place. He stopped. It was a small action, almost imperceptible to anyone else. But in this house, it carried weight. And Naomi paused as well, not out of fear, but out of awareness, her gaze lifting to meet his, steady, composed, waiting. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them, not uncomfortable, but deliberate. And then Dominic did something even more unfamiliar, something that did not fit into the patterns he had followed for years. He addressed her directly. "Naomi," he said, her name clear, intentional, and the sound of it in that space seemed to shift the air itself, because it was not just a name, it was recognition, spoken aloud for the first time. And Naomi held his gaze, the smallest change in her expression, not surprise, not relief, but something quieter, something that reflected the significance of the moment without needing to announce it. The hallway remained still for a second longer, as if the house itself had paused to witness it, and in that brief exchange, something settled into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of certainty that did not require explanation, because for the first time in 5 years, she was no longer invisible, and Dominic knew it. The air in the hallway shifted after that single word, subtle but undeniable, and Naomi felt it not in the way others might, not as a moment of triumph or recognition to be held on to, but as a quiet recalibration of something that had long been out of balance, and she inclined her head slightly, not lowering her gaze as she had done for years, but meeting his eyes with calm steadiness before continuing down the corridor, her steps measured, unchanged in rhythm, yet no longer shaped by the need to disappear. Dominic remained where he was for a second longer, watching her walk away, not with the detached awareness he had once carried, but with a focus that followed her presence even after she turned the corner. And for the first time, he noticed how naturally she moved through the space, how every action she took seemed intentional, precise, and grounded, not rushed, not hesitant, but assured in a way that did not demand attention, yet deserved it. The rest of the house continued as it always did, staff passing through with quiet efficiency, conversations kept low, routines followed without deviation. But something had shifted beneath that surface, not because of anything dramatic, but because the center of attention had moved, even if only slightly, and Dominic felt it in the way his own awareness now lingered on details he had once dismissed. Later that morning, the dining room filled with its usual arrangement, sunlight filtering through tall windows, polished surfaces reflecting a carefully maintained order. And Dominic took his place at the head of the table, a position that had always defined the space around him. Yet today, his attention did not settle on the documents waiting beside his plate or the schedule laid out in front of him. Instead, it moved through the room, observing, noticing, until it found Naomi again as she entered quietly from the side door. She carried a tray with the same composed efficiency, placing items exactly where they belonged, her movements precise, her presence unobtrusive, and for a moment, it would have been easy to assume nothing had changed, that the structure of the house remained intact. But Dominic did not look away this time. He watched, not in scrutiny, but in acknowledgement, and when she stepped back after setting the table, he spoke again, not loudly, not to command attention, but clearly enough that it carried across the room. Stay. And the word settled into the space with quiet authority, not sharp, not forceful, but deliberate. Naomi paused, the tray still in her hands, her posture steady as she turned slightly towards him, and the other staff members, though trained not to react, felt the shift ripple through the room, because this was not part of the routine, this was not how things were done, and yet no one spoke, no one moved to question it. Dominic gestured subtly toward the empty chair at the far end of the table. Not beside him, not yet, but within the space that had always been reserved. And Naomi's gaze followed the motion, her expression composed, her thoughts unreadable. And for a brief second, time seemed to hold, as if waiting for her decision. She could have refused, could have stepped back into the role she had always known. But instead, she set the tray down carefully and moved toward the chair. Her steps unhurried, her posture upright, and as she took her seat, the room remained silent, not out of tension, but out of awareness that something had shifted in a way that could not be ignored. Dominic did not make a display of it. He did not explain or justify. He simply continued, reaching for his coffee, his movements calm, controlled, but no longer detached from the presence across from him. And for the first time, the table did not feel like a place of hierarchy alone, but a space where something else had entered, something quieter, something that did not rely on position to exist. Naomi sat with the same composure she had always carried, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her gaze steady, not lowered, not challenging, but present, and the silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the weight of recognition, of understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. Across the house, Matteo's room remained still, the calm of the night carrying into the morning, and for Dominic, that alone would have been enough to mark the moment as significant. But as he looked at Naomi now, sitting where she had never been invited before, he understood that the change was not limited to a single room or a single night. It had extended into the structure of everything he thought he controlled. He set his cup down slowly, his gaze meeting hers again. And there was no hesitation this time, no uncertainty in the way he held that moment, because the decision had already been made. Not through words, but through action, and the room, quiet and observant, seemed to recognize it as well, because nothing returned to the way it had been. Not after this, not after the space between them had been closed in a way that could not be undone. The room did not return to normal after that morning, not in the way it had before, because something subtle but irreversible had taken root. And even as the staff resumed their routines, moving through the house with the same quiet efficiency, there was an awareness now, a shift that could not be named but could be felt in the way glances lingered a fraction longer, in the way silence carried meaning instead of absence. Naomi rose from the table when her role required it, not lingering beyond what was necessary. Her movements still composed, still measured, but no longer shaped by invisibility. And as she stepped away, Dominic watched her go, not with authority, but with recognition that followed her presence even after she left the room. Later that afternoon, the house settled into a quieter rhythm, sunlight stretching across the floors, the echoes of the storm replaced by a calm that felt earned rather than restored. And Dominic found himself outside Matteo's room once again, his hand resting briefly against the door before he entered, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, as if he understood now that presence required intention. Matteo sat near the window, a book open in his lap, his posture relaxed, his breathing steady, and when he looked up, there was no trace of the panic that had filled the night before, only a quiet recognition that met his father's gaze without resistance. And Dominic stepped inside, his movements slower, more deliberate, closing the distance without disrupting the calm that had taken hold. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice lower than it had been in the past, not because it needed to be, but because it had changed. And Matteo considered the question for a moment before answering simply, "Better," and the word carried more weight than its size suggested, because it was not just about the moment, it was about something deeper, something that had shifted overnight. Dominic nodded, absorbing that. And his gaze moved briefly around the room, noting the small details he had overlooked before, the placement of objects, the order within the space, the quiet evidence of care that had always been there without his acknowledgement. And then his attention returned to Matteo. "Would you like her to come back?" he asked, not as a decision already made, but as a question, one that gave his son a voice in a way he had not before. Matteo's answer was immediate, not loud, not urgent, but certain. Yes. And Dominic felt that again, that steady realization settling into place, not as something unexpected now, but as something that made sense when he stepped back into the hallway. The house felt different again, not because it had changed physically, but because he had. And as he moved through it, his attention no longer passed over the people within it. It rested. It noticed. It acknowledged. Naomi was in the corridor outside the study, organizing a set of files that had been left unattended. Her posture upright, her movements precise, and when Dominic approached, she looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation. The quiet understanding between them still present, still unspoken. "Matteo asked for you," he said, his tone steady, and Naomi inclined her head slightly. Not in surprise, but in acknowledgement, as if she had expected this, not as an outcome, but as a continuation of what had already begun. She moved with him down the hallway, not behind, not ahead, but beside, their steps aligned without discussion, and when they reached the door, Dominic stepped aside, not as a gesture of authority, but as an invitation, allowing her to enter first. And Naomi paused for a brief second before crossing the threshold, not because she needed permission, but because the moment carried weight. Inside, Matteo looked up, his expression softening in a way that did not need explanation, and Naomi approached with the same calm presence she had carried the night before, her voice gentle, her movements unhurried, and Dominic remained by the door, watching, not as an outsider, but as someone who understood now that what mattered in that room could not be commanded, only respected. The afternoon passed quietly, the kind of quiet that no longer felt empty, and as the light began to shift toward evening, casting longer shadows across the floor, Dominic stepped back slightly, his gaze moving between his son and Naomi, and there was no question left in his mind, no uncertainty about what had changed, because it was no longer just visible, it was undeniable. He had built a world where everything had its place, where order was maintained through control. But this had not come from control. It had come from something he had overlooked, something that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. And as he stood there, in the quiet of that room, watching the two of them exist in a space defined not by power, but by understanding, he realized that the most important shift had not happened in his son. It had happened in him, because for the first time, he was not just looking at the world he had built, he was seeing the people within it. And in that moment, the silence of the house carried a different meaning, not absence, not control, but recognition. And that was something that could not be undone.